Well, I think we have a few more people that are coming in, but I'm going to go ahead and start. Also want to point out to participants that this webinar will be recorded. We have quite a number of individuals that have asked for a recording to be sent to them because they needed to be elsewhere today or had other classes. I'm Tom Doherty. I'm chair of the Warburg Program at Simmons in the Department of Political Science and International Relations. And on behalf of the Warburg Program, and on behalf of Dr. Michelle Putnam, Director of the School of Social Work, I'd like to welcome everyone today to what I think will really be an extraordinarily interesting conversation with Dr. Harris Eyre. Before we start, just want to go over a couple of logistics. I've already mentioned that we'll record the webinar for those that can't be here. Dr. Harris will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end that Dr. Putnam will moderate. As you have questions, just go ahead and enter them into the chat, either during the presentation by Dr. Eyre or after when Q's and A's start. We'd really appreciate your input, and I think you'll find many things that you want to ask him about. I promise to keep the introduction really, really short because I know you've all had the opportunity to read the biography that was sent out by the Warburg Program. I thought what was most interesting about the biography was perhaps the first sentence, that it's rather hard to categorize Harris Eyre because of really the nature of what he does. It's a very interdisciplinary, very exciting, very innovative combination of experiences and expertise that he brings to the table with him. And I think that that's particularly interesting in the concept of brain diplomacy and brain health. As someone who for many, many years was a traditional diplomat, I have to admit at the beginning, I don't want to say I was skeptical about the concept of brain diplomacy, but I was frankly kind of thick about it. It didn't make sense in the sense of traditional diplomacy where you negotiate treaties or you try to come to compromises on bilateral types of issues. But in thinking of the concept of brain security in a much more global way and a much more contemporary way in the human security context of the types of challenges that we face today, it didn't take me very long listening to Harris, reading many of the articles that he's written to understand what the concept is. And in terms of human security, which is always defined as being a cluster of complex, interrelated, and global challenges, I can think of few concepts that are more interrelated, more complex, more urgent, and more in need of global cooperation than brain health and brain diplomacy. I'm not going to say anything more because I know that in the presentation itself, you'll learn more about the concept and how Harris found himself in the really interesting role that he's playing now. Only one thing that I would like to add is that Harris, as you're going to hear very soon when he speaks, is from Australia. I think you've read that, but you'll also hear it as well, and came to the United States initially after studying in Australia, where he got his MD in psychiatry and his PhD in neuroscience. Came to the United States to study at UCLA on a Fulbright scholarship, went back to Australia, then came back to the United States. And I mention that in the context of, I think, Harris would agree with me, that opened a lot of doors, created a lot of networks for him, and made him truly the consummate networker and citizen of the world, which has come in very useful for the work that he does. Just in the last year that I'm aware of, in fact, every time I have any kind of communication with Harris at all, it's like he writes back and it's almost immediate. But sometimes it's, hi, I'm back in Australia, or I'm still in California, which is where he is today, or no, I'm in Houston, no, I'm in Sharm el-Sheikh at the COP27 conference in Egypt. No, I'm in New York today at the United Nations General Assembly, or in Europe, talking with the Europeans at the OECD about the initiative that you're all going to be hearing about today. So would encourage Simmons students to look into the same type of opportunities for international exchange that Harris profited from. but particularly, and I'm very, very glad that the School of Social Work is able to take part today as well, because I think both on the policy level, which is what I focused most of my career on, but certainly on the practical level for the School of Social Work, it's going to be a really, really interesting webinar. So with that, I pass it over to Harris. Again, thank you very much for being here with us today from California, Harris.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, for that introduction. And thank you for hosting this, as well as to Michelle or Professor Putnam for co-hosting this as well, between the Warburg Program and then also the School of Social Work. And on the topic of the Fulbright Scholarship, as Tom said, definitely want to encourage people to look into that and apply for it if it interests you. You can see today here, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Fulbright. If it wasn't for the Fulbright program, I would never have met Tom, Ambassador Doherty, and I would never have been able to bounce my thinking about brain diplomacy past Tom. And as you can see, he is initially skeptical, as he said, but through rounds of constructive dialogue between Tom and I, we've hopefully rendered something that's useful. And so I'm very grateful to the Fulbright program and also to Tom as well. And so let me begin by sharing my screen and my slides. I hope that this is now clear to you on the share screen. So let me get started. I want to talk about achieving brain health at scale, and I want to talk about how I think we can do this through diplomacy. And you can see here my affiliations. I work with various groups internationally and then also in the United States. And so I'm very grateful to them for their support. Okay, let's get into some of these challenges. As Tom mentioned, challenges that are interrelated and complex. So globally, mental illnesses cost the economy $1 trillion every year. And this is actually projected to increase to about $15 trillion in the coming 15 years. So this is a massive issue for the global economy and a massive issue for global society. This is really not trivial at all. This is really foundational to the way that society operates. And then secondarily, as the World Bank said here, we're actually, during COVID, we lost a generation due to educational disruptions during COVID. So again, it's very serious. To think that we might have lost a generation due to educational disruption is very profound for our workforce of the future and our citizens of the future. How do we catch that up? And of course, many people that were affected by COVID education disruptions were from lower socioeconomic status, whether it was in America or in different countries. And then finally, we have here massive issues with social media and social media's effect on particularly teenage girls, but teenagers everywhere. And there is a lot of interest in regulation and litigation against social media companies. And I wanted to put that in because I know that there are a lot of undergrad students here on the call today, and you guys are digital natives. And so I'd love to get your support in thinking this through. Is this a big deal? The effect of social media on our brains? Is it not a big deal? What would you like to see to be done about this? Because I hope that this presentation is kind of a two-way conversation, not just me talking about stuff and giving you the gospel according to Harris, but we can render something together. So another way of framing these brain challenges, and in a second slide, is to say that there are these clinical issues that you've heard about: stress, long COVID, like brain fog, Alzheimer's disease, depression. These are all challenges that we're dealing with, again, in the US and around the world. And then really strikingly, other brain challenges that we probably don't traditionally think of as brain challenges are things like mis and disinformation or fake news. Air pollution can affect our brain. Nanoplastics, we're finding that there are plastics breaking down in our environment. They're being found on the top of Mount Everest, the bottom of the Marianas Trench, and in breast milk, in human breast milk. So that's a big issue. We don't really understand what that's doing to our brains, but it's whatever it is, it's probably not good and we need to investigate it. Social media, and then also doom scrolling. I again put that for the undergrads. That's a very Gen Z term, doom scrolling, which a lot of people did during COVID. I did, certainly, and then I had to stop myself from doing it. So as Tom said, when we take all these challenges together, they're interconnected, they're complicated, and we do need global alignment to tackle these issues. And so now you can see where I'm linking into diplomacy. So this is the despair situation, that this is very overwhelming and very negative. So let's talk about opportunities, because the only option we have is to go on and to try to tackle these things. I think that brain health brings hope. I think that brain health offers a new way to think about these issues and to try to address them. And why do I think that? Because brain health goes beyond mental health and neurological conditions to look at not just the deficits of how depressed are you, how cognitively impaired are you, how dumb are you, but it looks at the strengths. It looks at how resilient are you, how creative are you, how gritty are you. So it's inherently less stigmatizing. It's relevant to everyone. It's not just people that have brain conditions that need to think about their brain health. It's literally everyone, because everyone wants to prevent dementia. Everyone wants to manage, improve their concentration, things like that. So it also gives us hope, because it's taking us into a new paradigm, and it has less historic baggage. Those of you who have thought about the fields of neurology and mental health will be aware of the history. There's a lot of baggage associated with these disciplines, and so we need to take the good of these disciplines and then try to sort of recognize the unethical or things that were done in the past, like ice pick lobotomies. We need to sort of bring the positive things of these disciplines forward into a new frontier, and I think that brain health is that. So this is my contention to you today. And it's lovely to see that the World Health Organization is picking this up and thinks that this is a big deal. And I was fortunate to contribute to this report that the WHO recently put out. They said that investing in building brain health is fundamental to meeting modern societal challenges and to driving innovation. To meet modern societal challenges, we need people that are creative, that are energized, and to drive innovation, we also need energized, focused people. So brain health is really, really critical. So my brain story, I wanted to share my story with you because I think it takes this from being out of the abstract and into the real world. I grew up in Mackay in northeastern Australia, a town of 60,000 people. It's now 100,000 people. It's a town very, very relatively isolated and driven by coal mining and sugarcane harvesting. I developed migraine with visual aura, with vision disturbances in my teenage years. That meant that, it was inherited from my mom, and basically I don't know the trigger. And about every month I would get a migraine where I would just sort of lose my vision. As you can see in this little graphic here, I'd get vision problems for about an hour where I couldn't do anything. I couldn't work. I certainly couldn't drive or anything like that. And then I'd get 4 hours of a pinpoint throbbing headache deep in my brain, which would cause me to vomit and barf, as you say in America. We say vomit in Australia, which is interesting linguistic differences. And then I would be obviously very, very tired for the next 24 hours because I'd been nauseous and vomiting. So I dealt with this issue of migraine since I was about 14 years old. And it certainly has led me into an interest in the brain and an interest in brain health. It's not the most debilitating condition to have, of course, but it's also not nothing. And so that really led me into the caring fields of medicine. I was very fortunate that the government had established a medical school up around northeastern Australia where I grew up, called James Cook University. And so I got into medical school, fortunately, which sort of, again, you can see allowed me to sort of take the experience of suffering from migraines and try to help other people. That led me ultimately through medical school, which I did undergraduate, different to the way you do it in America, to medical rotations in North Queensland and far North Queensland. So I did rotations in towns of maybe 200,000 people as the biggest, and then towns of 500 people at the smallest, and a lot of also First Nations community medical work I did as well. So that has changed my life, absolutely. Growing up as a sort of a white straight guy in a conservative house, to then go into medical school in a very cosmopolitan med school, and then to do rotations in First Nations communities and in very, very rural communities was amazing for me, and a big mindset shift, and gave me an appreciation for the variety of life and the way that people live, and cultural differences and spiritual differences. All of this stuff led me to pursue a career in the brain field, psychiatry and in neuroscience. So again, I'm teeing up how I got to where I am today, how I'm sitting in front of you. I realized when I had finished med school, when I was about 23 years old, that I wanted to see more of the world than just northeastern Australia. Even though that's a great place to live, I thought, gee, there must be more to the world. So I applied for the Fulbright, and I fortunately got it, which is how Tom and I met. And I conducted my PhD at UCLA in Beverly Hills. So I literally went from remote Indigenous communities in Northern Australia to Beverly Hills. Massive culture shock, but again, gave me an appreciation for the variety of life and humanity. Ultimately, after I'd finished medical work and neuroscience research work, I undertook a career in neuroscience business. How do we take innovations in neuroscience and translate them into products and services, better ways of diagnosing and treating brain conditions, whether that's autism in kids, Alzheimer's disease, or Parkinson's disease in older adults. So this is really interesting for me. I wanted to try to achieve scale in my career. And as you can tell, the scale interest continues, because there's nothing more sort of scalable and holistic than brain diplomacy, which is what we're talking about today. Fundamentally, I realized that working in the neuroscience technology business world was great, and it can achieve a lot of benefits for people. And we have some wonderful neuroscience business people on the line today, Peter Sava and Vicky Zakopoulos from Boston, from a wonderful company called Like Minds. This is really important as an engine for improving brain health for people, to get them better diagnostic and treatment approaches to brain disorders. But I also realized that we need to match this with policy change as well, and we need to match this with investing. And so therefore, these things kind of come together and mesh together. We can't just have all policy, and we can't just have all technology. We need some kind of hybrid. We need to leverage the public sector and the private sector together. And that's really what I do today. Is I think a lot about, half the week I'm thinking about private sector neuroscience businesses and how to get better treatment and diagnostics to people. And the other half of the week I'm thinking about policy. How do we change policy? How do we influence state capitals and DC and the European Union and such to improve better outcomes for people's brain health? But I'd also like to say that I'm treatment responsive with my migraines now. No drug ever worked for me until 3 years ago. I came across this one medication that now allows me to not get the headaches and to not be washed out for the day after my migraines. So now I still get the vision problems, and I still don't know what causes the vision problems. It still strikes me down at any moment, but at least I'm not getting the headaches. So I thank very much modern neuroscience for this innovation, because I'm frankly mostly treated now from my migraines. But I hope that this is helpful to frame up how I got to where I am today. I now view migraines as really a superpower, and it's easy to say that now that I have a medication that works. I'm in a better sort of mood and emotions about it, but I want to encourage to thinking about brain issues as let's think about some positive things, not just wallow in the negative aspects. It gives you empathy and compassion. It gives you a purpose. If you want to turn your suffering into some kind of purpose in life, like I am trying to do by talking about brain diplomacy with you today, migraines have led me to recognize that there are global inequities in healthcare, because the drug that works for me is actually not available in any other country. And that's not good. There could be people like me in other countries that are suffering when they don't have to. Also, having migraines, I'm told by my neurologist, helps people like me to keep their other health conditions in check, like exercise, eat healthy, because you're always trying to optimize your lifestyle so you don't get a migraine. And when you don't know what it is, you just try to keep everything really well controlled. So you exercise a little bit more and sleep well and all this kind of stuff. Don't drink very much alcohol, much caffeine. So I'm told that actually having migraines may mean that I get less heart disease and diabetes when I get older, which that's certainly very, very valuable. I also learned that teamwork is very important, because I don't really ever like to be the one guy that everyone's depending on to get a certain thing done. Because if I have a migraine, I'm going to let people down. I feel as if working in teams for me is a lot better, because I can get more done, and no one's really relying on me in a sense. So it's sort of a way of getting more done and working socially with people. And then also I realized that just grinding really hard work for me is probably not the best for my health. So I try to cultivate creative flashes and insights, things that will help me to be good at my job and be good at helping people that are creative, that means that I don't need to just keep grinding long hours. If I can just cultivate a creative insight and then write some good framework or come up with some good idea for a business, then that's really wonderful. And I wrote all of this recently, just published on Monday in a blog that I'm happy to share the link for people if they're interested. And it's all about why I think my migraines are a superpower. So if this speaks to you and is helpful to you, I would encourage it. And it also, I hope, encourages people to talk about their own brain story. This is my brain story and my attempt to understand how migraines have impacted me, and I hope that it can be useful to others. So what is your brain story? What impact has a brain disorder had on you, whether it's you personally, your friend, a family member, a colleague? And then also, the challenge today for us all as we talk about diplomacy is, what can we all do to ensure that best practices for brain health are available to everyone? Everyone across socioeconomic status in the country, in the US, across cultures, and then also globally. How can we leverage diplomacy to make this happen? And of course, as I've mentioned, brain health is relevant across the lifespan. We all sit here on a continuum somewhere, or we have friends and family on a continuum somewhere, and we all have positive things that we're doing for our own brain health in blue that are making it better. Exercise, for example, is better for our brain health. And we all have negative red things pointing down that are not so good, things like stress, social isolation. So it's just interesting to project where you sit on this spectrum. What are you doing well for your brain health, and what could you be doing better for your brain health? Now I want to transition to talking about some select programs across the lifespan that I admire that may interest you, as we're thinking about how to cross-pollinate best practices around the world. This is a TED Talk, and I apologize that it's snipped off a little bit. It's a TED Talk, and it's called How Every Child Can Thrive by 5, and it was a talk given by Molly Wright. She's a 6-year-old Australian girl, and she's talking in this TED Talk, which only goes for 7.5 minutes. I encourage you all to check it out. And Molly is talking about early childhood brain development, and what does that mean to her? And what does it mean to the little baby there, Ari, that is co-presenting next to Molly? So really important advocacy. This was the most watched TED Talk of last year of any TED Talk in the world. So really they knocked it out of the park. It's an example of using really good media and really good storytelling to try to influence people. And I would assume that it's been viewed, 10 million times approximately, but I'm sure it has, outside of TED on YouTube, has been probably viewed hundreds of millions of times and talked about many, many millions of times. Now I want to talk about, for a slightly older age group, My Brain Robbie. This is really a cartoon version of the brain, and this is for kids, educating kids about brain health. So Robbie is the little brain guy there, And Robbie has a series of cartoons where he talks about things that are good for your brain, things like lots of sleep, lots of positive social interactions with friends, going to the doctor, wearing a helmet, not getting head injuries, exercise, stuff like that. Another really, I think, nice use of digital media and communications to improve brain health. And this is available in many languages. And again, you can check this out online. Then, of course, important to note that the White House, you guys would have seen this last year, took a really big interest in youth mental health. That is, for a lot of the undergrads on the line, that's you guys. It's right. It's like 15 years to 25 years, depending on how you describe youth mental health. But youth mental health is really under assault in America, you know, through COVID issues, social isolation, social media, you know, big issues. And so wonderful to see that the White House took this so seriously. I think we should be very proud of this in America, that that Biden and Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General, took this so seriously. And then I, of course, want to mention at the latter part of life, how do you improve brain health? Well, you improve all of these things here. You know, look for education, physical activity, social contact. You manage hearing loss issues, hypertension, obesity, smoking, depression, diabetes. You drink to moderation, and you reduce air pollution exposure, and then head injuries. And if we do all of these things together, we can actually prevent 40% of dementia cases. So this is a nice little graphic from USC in Los Angeles. So again, this is the kind of thing you can see that if we have best practice principles, we can cross-pollinate this stuff around the world, and we can really massively cut rates of brain issues like dementia if we implement this well, again, with good public policy, but also with good technologies. So let's talk about brain diplomacy now. I've framed up the challenges, I've framed up the opportunity, I've framed up some example programs, my own story. Now let's get into brain diplomacy. The brain diplomacy is a field that colleagues and I have developed over the last couple of years, really over the last 2 years. So I'm very grateful to the Global Brain Health Institute that you can see the logo above here, which is a wonderful program that trains people in their mid-career in really best practices for brain health around the world. You know, as you finish PhDs and postdocs, you can certainly think about applying to the Global Brain Health Institute. It operates between UCSF and Trinity College Dublin. Anyway, this is a paper here on the left that you can look at if you're interested, and another blog post on the right that you can look at if you're interested. So why brain diplomacy? Well, we're aiming to eliminate the complex threats to brain health that and looking at this, eliminating complex threats to brain health at individual levels, community levels, national and international levels. And we want to do this leveraging diplomacy practices. So that's what this is all about. Brain diplomacy leverages and integrates insights from all these different fields: science diplomacy, health diplomacy, innovation diplomacy, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to break these down one by one and give you some examples of how this actually works. But this is the concept of brain diplomacy. You know, when you're creating a new field, and brain diplomacy is a new field, when you do this, you know, you start academically with a framework, and you need to explain why brain diplomacy is novel and unique and how it integrates existing disciplines. And so that's what I'm trying to do here, is to justify why this is a unique and important area. I also want to mention that we are developing, colleagues and I, a brain health diplomats toolkit to sort of distill this stuff down. Really what I'm talking about across this whole talk: how do we distill this down, and how do we use this for folks in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is obviously a region of the world with a lot of low and middle income countries and settings that needs a lot of help. So we have this toolkit. It's not published yet, but it should be published in the coming months. And so I'd be glad to share it with you when it's out. And this is a concrete example of how we're distilling this brain health diplomacy stuff into something tangible that's useful to people. So let's talk about science diplomacy. We live in multicultural communities. We don't just live in white communities. And so science diplomacy, is important to recognize that most brain science has been done on white populations or Caucasian populations. But so that's not good enough. We need to have a lot of ethnic variability when we do brain science, so we can have a better understanding of what's driving the condition, how to diagnose the condition, how to treat the condition, how to prevent the condition. And we need to recognize that diagnostic and treatment methods are not adequate right now. They could be much, much, much better. And so we need science to drive that. But it's important to recognize that the infrastructure to do science in low and middle income settings, whether it's in poor First Nations communities in America or whether it's in rural Honduras, the infrastructure is not there, right? You don't have easy access to scientists, to clinics, to MRI machines, to genetics machines. So science diplomacy aims to try to break these issues down and to try to do science in different areas in low middle income settings and in culturally diverse settings. And this group here, LAC-CD, the Latin American and Caribbean Consortium on Dementia, they're doing this in, again, Latin America and the Caribbean. They're making brain imaging and genetics and all sorts of different advanced science available in rural communities in, Colombia, Argentina, et cetera, et cetera. So this is being done. So I hope that this encapsulates science diplomacy for you. Health diplomacy, well, it's important to recognize that the quality of health differs wildly across the US. We know that very well. Boston, where you guys are mostly, I think, is amazing for healthcare, compared to rural Alabama, right? Very different. We also know that healthcare quality differs across high, low, and middle income settings around the world. I said before that the migraine drug that I use is actually not available in any other country in the world right now. So that's an example of an inequality. And so we know that best practices can be leveraged and made more equal across the world. That's what health diplomacy seeks to do. And I wanted to say that this is an example project coming from the Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute. It's called the Lone Star Depression Grand Challenge. What they're looking to do in North Texas, in the area of Dallas and just generally North Texas across to Amarillo, Texas, they're trying to halve rates of depression. And so what they're doing, amazingly enough, is they're leveraging some digital innovations to try to help people get care through apps and telemedicine for their depression. But they're also training lay people, training everyday common people in basic ways of helping to recognize and treat depression. And where did they get this training of lay people from? They got it from rural India. So there, it's an example of kind of a pollination, not from a high-income country to a low-middle-income country, but from India to America. I think this is a good example of health diplomacy in action to reduce rates of depression in North Texas. So digital diplomacy, I think this is super important area. We know that there are seriously negative effects of social media and digital media globally. There's bullying happening on social media, toxic image perfection, particularly for teenage girls. There's suicide contagion issues, suicide sort of being promoted on some of these platforms. There's cybercrime. There's fake news being spread. We know, of course, in America that fake news is kind of everywhere and, significantly led to the January 6th insurrection. And so fake news leads to radicalization. It leads to radicalization against the state. So this is the negative side of a digital environment that we're in, right? The US has a vested interest in generating revenue from big tech companies like Meta, right? The US has an interest in their economic performance. And the US also has an interest in their power of, these companies are very powerful. They act like nation states. And if they're tethered in America, mostly in Silicon Valley, then that's good for the American government in some ways. Of course, there's lots of downsides that we recognize as well. But what I'm saying is that there's an incentive, there's conflicting incentives in America to really manage this issue. because if you manage these issues with digital media and social media, you could harm the revenue and therefore the power of these companies. So therefore, I argue that digital diplomacy may be needed to help America to tame these entities. America alone may not be able to manage this issue because there's too many conflicting interest groups, but what if other countries get into the action and help Americans to think about, and American policymakers and policy strategists to manage this stuff? So I thought it was interesting then to see, this just came out hot off the press a couple of days ago, that there are increasingly lawsuits against social media companies, people arguing that social media is fueling mental health issues, particularly amongst youth. So, you know, it looks to me like there is a bit of a rolling stone here. There are more and more lawsuits and people wanting regulation or action on social media companies. And so what happens then if the European Union, which is obviously the largest economic bloc in the world, takes an interest in this and in solving this? America is no longer the only one that has to solve the issue. The European Union could come in as a digital diplomacy strategy. And it's fascinating to see that the European Union opened an embassy in Silicon Valley. So the European Union is treating Silicon Valley like its own country now. So, you know, this is an example of, if we can get the right kind of approach from the European Union, they could help us to manage this issue, to keep the positive sides of social media companies, but to mitigate the downsides, to try to be a bit more responsible. And then getting to my last couple of slides now, I wanted to mention innovation diplomacy. As you can imagine, this is about trying to get innovation occurring equitably around the world. But the bulk of venture capital in the brain field is in the US. So a bulk of the investment money in the companies are in America. That's good for us, but it's not good for other countries around the world. Other countries are just as much, if not more, in need of new tools to treat brain conditions, to diagnose and treat brain conditions. So how do we try to harness the positive aspects of innovation and investment in the American brain innovation industry, but distribute that around the world so that it's a bit more equitable? And I know that some of the people on the call, like Peter and Vicky, who I mentioned before, are thinking about this. How do they achieve this in America, but then also globally in other countries, and looking at ways of accessing capital in different parts of the world? So it's, you know, good people are thinking about this stuff. And so in that regard, I wanted to mention this initiative of the United Nations called the Health Innovation Exchange. This is all about cross-pollinating technological innovations for health between high-income countries and low-middle-income countries, and it can go both ways. So I think this is an example of a mechanism that the UN has established to try to make innovation flow more freely around the world. And then finally, to talk about economic diplomacy, this is obviously evoking economics. The world is really driven by economics, right? The world is driven by money, at least the way that the current neoliberal economic system works. And brain challenges are expensive, as I talked about before. So just brain conditions alone cost trillions per year. But when you think about, you know, brain conditions plus fake news, radicalization, and cybercrime, it's huge amount of money. And these things all affect, you know, not just the economic productivity, but social cohesion and health. So economics can be a useful discipline to speak to politicians, to speak to business leaders, to speak to policymakers, because they think in terms of economics, they think in terms of GDP, they think in terms of the labor workforce and such. So how do we as brain people leverage economics to make this happen? And this is where, you know, I'm involved with a group of people around the world in leading the field of brain capital. Brain capital is a new economic asset class that we're articulating to say, hey, heads of state, don't just think about the assets of your country as, you know, your GDP and your roads and bridges. Think about the brain capital, the brain health, and the brain skills of your people. How happy are they? How well are they going health-wise? Are they thriving? Are they flourishing? Are they resistant to misinformation? Are they resistant to cybercrime? This is really what we're doing with the Brain Capital Alliance. And if you're interested, I can talk more about it. And here's a little graphic below that sort of explains a little bit of the economic theory behind what we're doing. So that's my conclusion of brain diplomacy and how it all integrates with these other different disciplines of diplomacy. Brain diplomacy is a hybrid form of these things. So I want to recap now the core questions for today. What is your brain story? You've heard my brain story. You can read about it in more detail if you're interested. What's your brain story? How can your brain story help your friends, your family, your colleagues to think about, how to better cope with a brain challenge or a mental health challenge that you're dealing with? And then how can we all help as individuals on this call interested in diplomacy? How can we help to disseminate best practices in brain health around the world in diverse groups? So really, final slide now is to say that, as I've mentioned, there's a diverse array of global brain challenges that I talked about, not just clinical ones, but non-clinical ones. We do need global coordination to tackle these issues, as I have argued and Tom has said as well. And he's much more knowledgeable on these things than I am, so he's a good person to listen to. Doctors and scientists working in silos is not sufficient, and hopefully one of the things that Michelle and I can talk about is how we need doctors and scientists and social workers and economists all working together in a sort of multidisciplinary team. No hierarchy, everyone's important, and we also need diplomats in that as well. Brain health, I argue, brings renewed hope. And then we need new age diplomacy to compare and contrast what's happening in countries, and then to disseminate and optimize equality between countries. So thank you very much for your attention and your interest. And I look forward to brainstorming about you and seeing what we can all do collectively to improve brain health at scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Harris. That was really interesting. And I'm wondering if anyone in our audience has any answers or responses to the questions you posed, but also any questions. So if you do, go ahead and type those into the chat, and I can forward those on to Harris. I'm wondering, one of my questions, Harris, just as you were speaking about it, is how, when people ask you, what's the difference between, I mean, you covered it, but what's the difference between like mental health and brain health? How do you help people who aren't thinking about this very much really conceptualize brain health in kind of in a concrete way that they can understand, engage with, and think about that umbrella differently than we traditionally have, particularly in the US?
Sure. Great question, Michelle. I do tend to think about brain health as more of a meta concept. Brain health encompasses the strengths of the brain and the deficits of the brain. It encompasses issues across the lifespan, mental health conditions like depression and bipolar, as well as neurological conditions. And so I see brain health as more of a meta concept that is bringing a little bit more of it's fresh, it's new, and it's a little bit more optimistic. Mental health and neurology kind of fall underneath it. So that's how I'm viewing it. But of course, I'm not some kind of draconian about this. I think that mental health is very important, and I came from the mental health community and love that community. And there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in mental health in and of itself, as same as with neurology. But I'm just trying to kind of provoke people to think a bit differently and challenge, how is there any little benefits we can get incrementally of thinking fresh in the coming months and years?
Yeah. Do you feel like then that the brain health, like that idea, that concept, helps us bridge the way that we've traditionally separated physical health and mental health, as if your brain is not really attached to the rest of your body sometimes? So I'm wondering if you see that concept as also helping us bridge and look at people in a much more holistic way. Obviously, you're taking that whole person and looking at that all the domains of their life too. But I'm wondering if you think that sort of what we talk about as a mind-body connection, which is silly because your mind is in your body, but if you think that helps erase those dichotomies too.
Yes. I think that as brain health is new, it gives us an opportunity to erase those dichotomies. Within brain health, we should incorporate thinking about brain and gut health and how they're linked, how this massive nerve called the vagus nerve runs between your gut and your brain, and healthy food is good for your brain and bad food is bad for your brain, all because of the neural signal transduction between the gut and the brain. So we need to incorporate that into brain health, and we need to incorporate the value of physical exercise and stuff like that, and how that manages chronic diseases, which ultimately is good for your brain as well. So I would like to see that brain body dichotomy dissolves with brain health.
Thanks. We have a question from the audience from Emmy, who's asking, how can we imagine a setting in which social workers can join into this brain health capital discipline?
This is a good challenge. I appreciate the challenge. And, again, I think let's think about brain health as a new concept. We know historically that there's been this kind of hierarchy in neurology and mental health. And that's kind of, I think that's reached a point of diminishing returns, having a hierarchy, command and control, particularly by physicians. So in brain health, hopefully we can reconceptualize the importance of, in the clinical world, multidisciplinary teams. Let's view social workers, nurses, speech therapists, OTs, etc., all as important as physicians. And I would argue that the rise of the social determinants of health and the social determinants of mental health, the importance of poverty, education, racism, etc. These, clearly we need to embed this into the way we think about healthcare and health policy moving forward. And that's obviously where social workers thrive, is in sort of identifying and correcting the social determinants of health. So I like social workers a lot, and I think that one of the things, Michelle, that we should talk about is how do we involve social workers more in this movement towards brain health?
Yeah, that would be great to do. A question from Joanna Almeida, who's on our social work faculty. How can we combat surges in loneliness, as well as the forces of capitalism that incentivize social media companies despite the adverse impact on brain and mental health?
This is not easy. I think if we break it down a little bit, how do we influence capitalism to care more about brain health? Well, brain capital that I mentioned at one part there under the economic diplomacy piece, we're trying to achieve this. Brain capital is very carefully chosen to speak to policymakers and politicians, policy strategists and politicians, so that we can give them, sometimes they're super brilliant and sometimes they're just truck drivers and not people with a lot of education. And so brain capital is simple enough that they can get it, and we can get them to understand that some forms of capitalism can be very detrimental to our brain health, like offshoring of jobs, can hollow out lots of industrial cities in America, and that's not good people's brain health. So they have to think about the brain as they're making policy decisions across sectors of the economy. So I think just making politicians aware of brain capital is important, so that they can balance capitalistic decisions and private and sort of money decisions with brain health. And then with the social media companies, this is such a devilishly complex thing. And I was just I know that Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, is coming out with a book any day now, and she was on TV over the weekend, and like we probably need some regulation, honestly. As much as we don't like to think about regulating companies, they probably do need some kind of regulation. But we do need to recognize that then, from a international relations and international power perspective, if we weaken these companies and they're kind of an extension of American society, then that's that's a challenge. We have to balance regulating these companies with letting them grow. So it's a sort of it's a very challenging decision to make, but we need to think about it. I don't have a perfect answer, but I'm really trying to come up with an answer.
Yeah, and that actually links into a question by another member of our social work school team. Sandra Bailly is asking, what does a time or a day look like in Washington? How do you tell a story there? Some of this you already mentioned, but how do you tell the story there? But what's the specific ask? And you also mentioned that a little bit, but when you're thinking about policy, what is that ask? And I'll just weave in, this is a perfect moment I teach a class in our doctoral program when we've just read a book for this week and last week that talks about the distance between researchers and scientists and policymakers and how difficult it is to bring those two communities together to use the science out there. It's a really neat book. So this sort of dovetails all into that Sandra's question and then this work we're doing in my class. So I'd happy to hear your answer.
So you know, it's easier to always go to DC with a very specific, you know, problem and solution, right? So that tends to be the easiest way of getting something done. You want some, you know, depression therapy to be paid for by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. You go with people that can tell their personal story or family members of people with lived experience. You go with scientists and you try to compel the politicians with stories, evocative stories, explaining in economic terms as well the problem and then the solution that you want to argue for. I think that's traditionally the way that things are done, is to be very, very precise and targeted. But certainly, I think as the questioner is picking up, I'm arguing for something a bit more systemic. And so, you know, I would think like just asking for something like an advisory board in the White House on neuroscience-inspired policy. That's the kind of thing that could be interesting. We wrote a paper proposing that we should have a brain council inside the office of the President of the United States, but that requires an act of Congress. So that maybe will take 20 years, where you can integrate across government, mental health, brain health, substance use, fake news, air pollution, nanoplastics, all these issues together. So if we can't get a council up and running, because that's obviously very difficult, we could start with some kind of symposium or an advisory board where we can have one group of people that's thinking about how important the human brain is to this country, how important it is to our social cohesion, our democracy, our productivity, all of the things that are insulting it, and all of the solutions that we need to think of.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer. I have two more questions that I think we can fit into our time slot. One is a question from Hugo Kanya, who is a member of our social work faculty as well. He is asking a question about, would you consider, or how do you think about cultural diplomacy as it relates to brain health, and what might that look like?
Wonderful question. And that probably should be part of brain diplomacy, cultural diplomacy. I think I've kind of mentioned cultural diplomacy within many elements of what I talked about with science and health diplomacy and et cetera, but it's critical. I think that we need to recognize that in America, there are many, many different cultures, and there are things that inhibit people from going and seeking care and help. You know, we know, say, for example, with the African-American community about the Tuskegee experiments that were done that make them very shy and wary of healthcare providers. And of course, in other countries, that just gets, it's even more complex. There are all sorts of cultural and language barriers. You know, my wife is Chinese American, and her family thinks partly about Western medicine and partly about Chinese traditional medicine. So if you're trying to convince their family members to do things that's good for their health, you've got to speak in Western terms and Chinese traditional medicine terms. And that's really complicated because I know nothing about Chinese traditional medicine. So I think cultural diplomacy is critical, and it can't be underestimated.
Thank you. Okay, last question comes by an anonymous questioner, but the question is about linking brain capital to working with civil engineers and city and community planners to develop more accessible infrastructure, public transportation, walkable communities, other community infrastructure benefits, and what connection that might have into improving brain health overall.
I love that question and the suggestions. I think that we're so influenced, our brains are so influenced by our environment. We know that if we exercise more, that's a good thing. So we need to make more walking spaces and biking spaces for people that are safe. We know that green space, walking in forests or around parks, actually can dampen down the stress part of our brain, which is good. So we need more parks and green space, similar to like being around blue space or oceans or bodies of water. We know that, any of us know, right? We walk into some buildings that are dark and dreary. It kind of puts you to sleep, or it makes you a little bit sad or a little bit low energy. If you walk into a building with lots of natural light, it can perk you up and make kind of almost inspire you. It's like this weird, subtle impact. So this is super important. And I think I want to do a piece of work on this, looking at sort of internal design, architecture, and the built environment of cities, to think about, how do we influence these things in a way that improves brain health at scale. And I am buoyed to know, I actually just spoke to a wonderful person yesterday whose name I won't mention and company I won't mention, but it's a large architecture practice, and they're focused on architecture for better brain health. And so, once we start to have companies that manage thousands of or hundreds of architects thinking about this stuff, we can start to have a really big systemic impact.
Yeah. Well, I think we've reached towards the end of our time. Tom, I don't know if you're going to hop back on or not. Harris, has been a really interesting discussion. I think it's really important for our folks at Simmons, and I'll say on behalf of the social work school, it's a really interesting concept and idea. I like the reframing bit can help us think about how our work too in that social work practice space, and really connecting into a new model, into a new paradigm, and reframing some of the work that we do as well, particularly as this moves forward. So it's been really great listening to you and then interacting with you around these questions. Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, Harris, maybe just one or two things. Thank you very much for the LinkedIn and the Twitter and the email, because I think there will be some people that would like to follow up with you. You've mentioned the toolkit that you have developed, and I had the good fortune of seeing a draft version of it a month or two ago. Found it really, really useful, and can imagine that practitioners, particularly in the School of Social Work, could find it useful as well. How soon will that be ready, and how open will it be?
Yes, well, and thank you, Tom, for reviewing it and giving it a sniff test and a kick and some feedback. And it certainly will be fully open and available, probably in about 3 to 4 months. And so I'd be glad to share it with you, Tom, and Michelle as well, so you can disseminate it amongst the Simmons community. Yeah.
Great.
And then we need to not just stop at this toolkit is generated for Latin America and the Caribbean. We want to then think about, what does this mean for other parts of the world, Asia, Eastern Europe, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, just from my perspective, just reviewing it, I mean, I found it really, really useful on bringing all of those interdisciplinary pieces together, but also getting back to one of the questions today about what do you say in Washington. It was really good from a policy perspective as well, because it did have those specific types of asks that people would want to influence policymakers to implement. So I think we'd get a lot of people that would be very interested in seeing that. So thank you. So Harris, speaking on behalf of all of us at Warburg School of Social Work and the entire university, really many thanks for a very intriguing, thought-provoking presentation. I pointed out at the beginning of the webinar that you were a citizen of the world, and that you've gone to all these nice places. I hope the next place that you actually physically come to might be Boston, and we'd look forward to seeing you here at Simmons on campus. But for today, really very pleased and honored that you joined us from California. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom, for the opportunity, and for the wonderful questions and comments from the audience. And thank you, Michelle, as well.
You're welcome. Thank you, Harris.
Bye-bye.